Greetings, friends. Today we'll be ranking different World War II nations based on their performances during the war. We will be looking at both military and political ability, and each nation will be judged based on their size and performances. So, for example, a nation such as Hungary, a much smaller, minor Axis power, will not be ranked the same way as Germany is. We will be ranking them according to their abilities. We'll be starting with Germany, the main protagonist of this war. As many of you know, Germany was actually preparing for this war and it came quite prepared in 1939 against Poland. Not only did it crush it in less than a month, but it already by then occupied much of the Central European region. 1 year later in France, it proved once again to be very capable force, taking out France in similar manner as it did to Poland. Once Soviet Union and America started joining the war, Germany started losing quite a bit, and although Germany was close to total domination, securing vast lands from the Soviets and maintaining a favorable loss ratio compared to the Soviets in the first years, politically, although effective, especially in the build-up to the war, Germany managed to secure quite a bit of Central Europe by its cover of diplomacy and also allies' blunders. It did, however, eventually fall politically, and I would say this is the biggest detriment to their ranking, as this radical National Socialist ideology not only alienated much of Europe and the world, it also proved to cause a lot of problems among the local population that it occupied. Populations such as the Poles and the Ukrainians would eventually rise against the Germans, proving quite a headache for them militarily. And diplomatically, Germany failed as well, as it didn't manage to unite the world under its banner, but rather actually unite the world against it, as the radical jingoist policy of the Nazis essentially alienated most of the world, forcing them to go on the defensive in the later stages of the war. And for this reason, I would have to say that yes, I still think that Germany performed on a S tier. I do, however, think that it's not a perfect S tier, and so therefore I would say that I would right now say that it's probably rather on the lower end of the S rating. Soviet Union. First, I would like to mention how it is popular to underrate Soviet Union. When it comes to World War II, people tend to mention how Soviets won with pure numbers, used human wave tactics, and massed mediocre tanks at the Germans. That is historically not very true. The Soviets in 1941 were in a panic mode, which in turn often produced unsatisfactory performances. However, by the late 1942 till 1945, the Soviets performed equally or often in a superior manner to the Germans, as seen in operations such as the Operation Uranus and in Kursk. Both the Soviets and Germans, after the first stage of Barbarossa, had very similar manpower bases as well, especially when you count in the Axis allies of Germany, such as Romania and Hungary. As for the equipment, the German army outside of the MG42 had inferior army materials. The T-34 and KV-1 was far ahead of the Panzer III and Panzer IV. It is true, however, that when the first Tiger and Panther tanks started running out, the Germans tended to focus more on the supremacy of the quality over mass production, like the Soviets and Americans did. But even then, the Soviet armor was more than capable in dealing the German tanks. Strategy wise, the Soviet political strategy was quite remarkable. The Molotov Ribbentrop Pact and siege of much of Eastern Europe was a strategic victory, as Soviets managed to secure vast lands without any major conflict. A major problem, however, and even humiliation for the Soviets, was the Finnish War, or the Northern War in 1940, where the Finns' strategic and especially tactical warfare surpassed the inexperienced and poorly prepared Soviet army. The Soviets lost around 5 times the soldiers compared to the Finns, and although they won the war, it was most certainly a Pyrrhic victory for them. The Soviet army would see improvement when the trial by fire of the German invasion gave them much needed experience and reasons to improve. The first stages of Operation Barbarossa were messy, and indeed the Soviets almost lost the whole war in the first year. If it wasn't for the tenacious defense of the Soviets and outside political blunders. After the victories in Moscow and Stalingrad, the Soviets will turn the tide and become the biggest threat to Germany, causing the highest percentages of casualties to the Germans compared to any nation in the war. It is also at this stage when the Soviet army started improving vastly, and although on the offense they would often have equal casualty rates to the Germans. I will still give them an A tier, as in my opinion they did not perform at an S tier, especially since they on paper should have had a bigger and better equipped army than the Germans in 1941. The Soviet High Command, including Stalin, got even the information from the British about the preparations of the German army, and although the Stalin would eventually believe it to be false, and although the Germans to get an operational advantage in Barbarossa, it is worth noting that the Soviet apologists often mention that the war was won by the Soviets primarily and they did all the heavy lifting, which I don't think is true. The Americans and British Lend-Lease was incredibly important asset to the Soviets, giving them vast reserves of trucks, rations, and hardware. The fact that the Allies also opened a second front in the West, bombing the Germans' industry to ruins and also, in general, impacting the war in the West, also proves this. So, unfortunately, the Soviets will not get an A tier. I think they rather deserve a top of A tier.
Up to mighty London came an Irish lad one day. All the streets were paved with gold, so everyone was.
Great Britain and the Commonwealth nations. I will include the British Commonwealth nations together with the British here, as they worked under the same operational and strategic system. Great Britain, interestingly enough, is the only Allied nation that have fought from the start and never surrendered, joining in 1939 on behalf of Poland and resisting the Germans in the West until 1945. This gives them a bonus to their ranking, as unlike the Soviets and Americans who joined in 1941, they had to experience the German blitzkrieg firsthand without much experience. However, as most Allied nations, they did a lot of blunders in the start of the war. The appeasement policy done by the British was a major determinant to the war, as it allowed Germany to secure rich industrial parts of the Central Europe without much conflict. People tend to forget that Czechoslovakia, which was essentially handed over to the Germans, was a major producer of arms in Europe, and this allowed the German army to gain vast reserves of tanks, small arms, and planes that helped them conquer much of Europe in the start. So this blunder not only was a miscalculation on the part of the British, but it was also an empowerment to the Germans. Furthermore, the British did little in the first years of the war, what people often recall as the phony war. The British could not do much to help the Poles, and I agree with this statement, but they could have done a lot more to pressure and harm the Germans. In the first year, the British, together with the French, had a sizable navy that could bombard the German coastline, and likewise, the Air Force was capable of doing great damage to the Western German garrisons and industrial base there. Dunkirk was another fiasco that could have cost the British 500,000 men. But luckily, due to the quick response by the British government and the German blunder, they did manage to escape to Britain. The British did eventually pick up their strategy after fall of France, performing well in Africa and knocking the Italians out of Ethiopia in the first years. The cooperation between the governments in exile was also important in the first years of the war, as they became quickly the spiritual leader of the Allies, especially after the collapse of the French. They would bite back against the Germans across Europe and Africa, and likewise the British Navy was a major prey during the European theater, limiting a German presence in European waters. So Britain did indeed perform quite well, but I think their blunders in the early war were similarly bad to the Soviet ones. However, the Soviets remain at an A tier compared to the British, due to the later parts of the war when both the Soviets and Americans essentially overtook the British ineffectiveness against the Germans, and actually being the ones that would push into Germany proper. This would sideline the British towards the end of the war, and we will see that after the war, Britain would lose much of its power in the world affairs. And for this reason, I think Britain deserves a B tier, unfortunately, compared to the Soviets in A and Germans in S. They did perform well, but they were eventually outshined by other allied nations. France. France, one of the most humiliated nations during the war. On the paper, the French had all they needed to perform well during the war. Their army was sizable, being larger than even the German army. Secondly, the equipment the French possessed was of good quality. Their small arms, artillery, navy, and planes were similar matched to the German ones, and the French tanks were even better. The problem was that the French militarily had quite poor morale, and likewise their strategy was outdated. The German dominated the French in the field. Once the Maginot Line broke, France would be overrun as quickly as the Poles were, while having a much better army. This just goes to show that the French army did not perform up to the standards that they were expected to. There is plenty of soldiers discussing the French morale. There is many from the Polish soldiers that came to France discussing how the French showed poor expression about the war and had very poor morale, shocking the Polish troops there. The French did not believe in the Blitzkrieg and thought that the defensive lines will hold against the Germans, as they did in the Great War. The French did come back under Charles de Gaulle fighting as Free France, but unfortunately this was more of a symbolic than effective fight. The Free French relied on Allied supplies and power to fight their battles, and politically the French did poorly as well, as they did little to limit the German rearmament in the early wars and similarly allowed for the German expansion. And this is made even worse by the fact that the French army was capable of pushing into Rhineland at the start of the war, while the Germans were occupied in Poland. For this, I think the French deserve the bottom of E tier. They are spared an F ranking due to the Free French forces and the fact that they went all in on a strategy that unfortunately was countered by the Germans. So I think E, like bottom of E tier, is a good ranking for the French here.
When Johnny comes marching home again,
United States, the absolute opposite of the French. They did very well in all aspects and suffered little to no blunders. Their industry was twice its size compared to the Germans, but it still played a vital role in securing the Allied victory. The US impacted favorably all its allies, such as the British and the Soviets, even, which often relied on the American land leases to supply their troops and fronts. And you could say that the Americans perhaps joined a little bit too late, as one of their shortcomings, allowing the Germans to win a lot more than they should have in the start. And Pearl Harbor was a gambit that could have been seen as a defeat. So yeah, there is some minor problems that the US faced, but then again, there is no nation on this list that did not fail at least once. The American equipment likewise was exceptional. Their planes, naval vessels, and tanks were all well made and produced in much bigger numbers than the Germans did produce in their German counterparts. The M4 Sherman tank is a good example of this, so much so that the Soviets, which got the tank in Lend Lease, fell in love with the tank, preferring it to their native T-34 design. And likewise, the Brits also used it for their stopgap development while they were producing the Comets. So the American equipment was very good, and their planes were also used by a lot of nations even after the war. All this qualifies Americans to a S tier, and although they were on paper more powerful than the Germans, which could be used against them, they did perform well with the cards they had, and these cards were very good. And on their operations, like the Operation Torch and the Overlord, were perfect example of this, where they excelled against the Germans. So I think they deserve a S tier and a high S tier compared to the Germans, so they will be put above them. And also, the another good thing about the Americans is that they performed well from the start till the end, whereas the Germans made many blunders throughout the war that cost them the war eventually. Japan, an Axis nation that started the war before any other in 1937. Japan became an Axis member first after signing the Tripartite Pact between Italy and Germany. And most nations during that time did not view Japan as a major threat, seeing them more as an Asian nation not comparable to the European feeders and states like Germany. Indeed, on paper, the Japanese did have a weaker industry, which was actually comparable to the Italian one. However, their military was quite sizable and much better than the Italian one. They were well trained and decently equipped. The Americans did have an eye on them since the Sino Japanese conflict, and likewise, the Brits also were kind of wary of the Japanese expansion Pacific. The Expansionist agenda of the Japanese resulted in a lot of souring of the relations between the Americans and the Japanese. And the Americans would eventually become one of the major nemesis of the Japanese, fighting them throughout the Pacific and being the ones that would eventually put the nail in the coffin. The Japanese did perform quite well against the Americans, but also against the Chinese. I am, however, skeptical to the idea that even without the American influence, if the Japanese could even manage to beat the Chinese united front, it is not to say that they did not fight well in the conflict. It's more so that much of the surrounding nations just were superior to the Japanese, either in manpower, resilience, or the industry. The Japanese spirit of the army allowed the Japanese to humiliate the Allies in places like Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, and even Indochina. They did this against the British, French, and the Americans, especially in the first years of the war. So the Japanese did do quite well with what they had, and politically, some people might point to the fact that Japan declared war on against the Americans and failed in the Pearl Harbor operation. However, I disagree due to the fact that although the Japanese failed to destroy enough of the American fleet, the plan itself, if it worked out, would be a massive win against the Americans and most likely would have allowed the Japanese to perform much better in the Pacific compared to our timeline. And especially if you understand that Japan was similar to Italy in its power, it is fair to say that they deserve a B tier, as simply because they performed that well with what they had, and even actually survived long enough to see Germany fall before them.
Se tu dall'altipiano guardi il mare.
Italy, the soft underbelly of the Axis. If we were to say some positive things about the Italians, I think it will be that they are sometimes put up to too high expectations by people. We have to understand that they were much weaker industrially, but also militarily compared to all its neighbors. And sometimes people expected the Italians to perform much better than they actually did. Their performances in, for example, Africa was not that humiliating, as the British had quite a superior force in terms of equipment compared to the Italians, and their planning was much better. The Italian military had a lot of corruption that unfortunately hampered it throughout the war. But unfortunately, there is where the positives end, as Italians performed poorly in all their theaters they fought in. The exception would maybe be the later years when the Italians fell under the command of the Germans, where the soldiers individually would perform quite well. But as we already said, in their colonies, they will be humiliated by the Brits, by a smaller force of the British. And yes, they were equipped much better, but even then, the Italians did put up quite a bad show in Africa. In general, they performed so poorly that the Germans would have to come and send them many times, and this is one of the things that make Italians, especially compared to the French, much poorer, as their blunders impacted the entire alliance of the Axis. So yes, the French did lose and all the Germans to seize control of much of the European continent. The Italians, on the other hand, and their blunders in places like Libya and especially Greece, impacted the war itself for the Germans. When the Italians invaded the Greeks against the wishes of the Germans, they would perform so poorly that the German Eastern Army, in preparation for the Soviet invasion, would have to come down and help the Italians. And doing this, they had to postpone their invasion by a couple of months, thanks to the Italian disaster. So things like this is what makes the Italians even worse than the French, as they would actively choose to do things against the wishes of their own allies and create a much weaker performance for everyone involved. For this reason, I think I will have to put Italy in the F tier. If Italy had the industry of France, I think they might have been even a bigger harm to the Germans, because they will most likely have worse invasions and try to invade even more countries. So I think, or even worse, maybe have to switch sides against the Germans. So I think Italians are unfortunately an F tier nation in performance.